9 o'clock, so I'm going to jump in and get us started on time. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Seminary Sunday morning again. All of us at MTS are glad that you are joining us and sharing in this time. And in these times, I know many of you have been through a number of the Sunday morning seminary sessions. So welcome back. I'm glad to be here with you on this second Sunday of Advent. And I hope your Advent has already brought you moments of light and joy as we're getting underway for this, holy season. So let me start by recapping and setting up where we are. By the way, I should say this. For those of you who like to read along, we're going to be reading in Luke 1 today. So if you want to have Bibles handy and have that ready, we'll be reading in Luke 1. So this series is about a new look at our Christmas stories. And here's why this kind of new look is really joyous for me. I quoted for you last week a Howard Thurman quote that has recently sort of struck me in a new way. The quote is, Howard Thurman, by the way, a great 20th century writer, activist, theologian, teacher, and he once said, don't ask what the world needs. Ask what makes you come alive and then go do it. Because what the world needs is alive people. And I've loved that quote for a long time. But recently it hit me that as a professor of New Testament, what I really encourage, work at, try and do myself is to read the Bible so as to come alive. To discover or think through doctrinal issues, yes. To learn history, yes. But most importantly, it seems to me for our spiritual journeys is to read the Bible to come alive. And one of the significant ways that we can do that is by enlarging and expanding our constructive imaginations, both as we read the Bible itself and then as a result of our Bible reading. And our constructive imaginations, just the really brief review of that, is that part of us that enables us to make sense of our lives and our worlds. For example, we talk about our self-image, and that's the way we imagine ourselves. And I'll bet you know people who have a painful self-image, and you know how that affects their lives. You may have been that person at some point, and if so, I hope your self-image is being healed. And that's a good way to talk about our imagination sometimes. Some parts of it, sometimes what we imagine needs to be healed. That's the constructive imagination. And that's the part of us that enables us to see, if I can use that language, what is possible because God is at work in the world. And so one of the ways that we read the Bible to come alive is to expand and enlarge our constructive imaginations. But sometimes reading the Bible to come alive in that way is actually more difficult with very familiar and beloved stories because we know them so well. They've become a little bit old hat to us. That's a phrase we use sometimes. And the Christmas stories can certainly fall into that so familiar category. So what I'm inviting us to do in our time together during this Advent is to read these stories anew, to read them afresh. I hope I'm going to be able to provide some new information for you that will enable us to encounter these stories in new and fresh ways so that they spark our sense of wonder again. And as a result of that, our imaginations are enlarged and expanded about what is possible because God has sent Jesus into the world. So last week, and by the way, I should tell you this, my notes over here, if you all see me kind of glancing this way, it's because my notes are right there. So I'll do that from time to time. I wish I had it all memorized, but I'm not that person, right? So last week, in the first of this session, we took note that the story of Jesus' birth is a beautiful and, for most of us, a much loved story. But it isn't a story unto itself, as sometimes we have treated it in church instead. The New Testament writers tell us that the coming of Jesus into the world is the fulfillment of God's promises to work in creation to achieve God's purposes for creation. God has promised that evil does not have the last word in God's good creation. Even as the nations rage, even as those who do evil are doing their worst, God is still at work, moving us to the moment when God will act in creation to bring about the renewal of all creation. God sent Jesus to save us, yes, but the story just doesn't stop there. God sent Jesus to inaugurate the renewal of all creation. The New Testament writers tell us that that's the impetus behind the sending of Jesus into the world. So last week, we took a look at that broad story, that overarching story that really shapes the New Testament telling of Jesus coming into the world. This week, we're going to look a bit more specifically. We're going to turn to the stories of Mary and Elizabeth in Luke 1. Another couple of familiar stories to us, and if you're like me, much beloved stories for us. But by looking at them through a new set of eyes with some new information, what we find is that we don't just have, again, lovely stories about two significant women, but we also get a first glimpse at what God's renewal of all creation looks like as God has sent Jesus into the world. So that's what we're going to work with today, and I invite you to follow along in Luke 1. Before we do that, though, to really allow these stories to expand and enlarge our imaginations, we're going to have to first be able to imagine them, these women, in their social and historical context. Bible nerd that I am, exploring the first century world has become one of the most meaningful kinds of learnings that I do, because it enables me to sort of go, and the phrase I use with my students all the time is go stand in the dirt of the first century world with those people who populate the pages of the New Testament. So we're going to do that today. I'm going to start by talking a bit about first century Rome and its ordering of the world. And then within that context, we can talk then about the place of women, of marriage, and of having babies. So that's where we begin today. One of my, again, Bible nerd that I am, one of my favorite ways to help us think about scripture. So let's start with first century Roman rule. Those of you who were with me last week may remember that I talked about in the 2nd century BC, it was the Syrian tyrant Antiochus Epiphanes who had such an impact on Jews in Israel, who occupied and oppressed Jews in Israel. But by the time we get to the 1st century BC, Rome has become the new king of the hill, so to speak. Rome is the power now occupying and oppressing Israel. Among the ways that Rome impacted their world is the way Rome ordered the world. It wasn't particularly new, but Rome did it with gusto, shall we say. So Roman order was, first of all, hierarchical, meaning that only a few people ruled everybody else. This past semester, while I've been teaching via Zoom, I've lamented many times not being in the classroom and not having the whiteboard behind me so that I could draw on the board an illustration of Roman hierarchy to remind students again of that kind of order and the way in which only a few people ruled over everybody else. And I guess I lamented that a lot because one of my students has actually made me a visual aid. So here it is. Okay. Jerry, if you're out there, thank you. I got this. So this pyramid structure is a way of illustrating Roman hierarchy. And you can see only a very few people are going to be here. And they rule over everybody else. And then everybody else sort of has to figure out their place in this structure and then how they relate to one another as a result of being in this place. Roman hierarchy is also patriarchal, meaning only men. The closer you get to the top in the power structures, the more and more and more you see only men in this world. This kind of structure, by the way, before I put this aside, this kind of structure, I hope you can see, is necessarily competitive. If only a few can be at the top, then everybody else is going to compete to try to be those few at the top. That makes it necessarily adversarial. Our relationships then with everybody on this kind of structure becomes adversarial because we're all trying to climb to the top. And it makes relationships necessarily comparative. I need to compare myself to you. Are you above me so that I need to figure out how to climb over you? Or are you below me and I need to figure out how to keep you there and probably to be afraid of you, afraid that you are trying to climb your way up and over me. And so that kind of order is what Rome did. They did it, like I said, with gusto and with intentionality in the first century world. Okay? In addition to being hierarchical and patriarchal, this culture was also a shame-honor culture. By contrast, ours is what I would call a guilt culture. We try to get people to conform to certain behaviors by guilting them into it. You know, you hurt me or you hurt, you know, someone. And so we try to get people to not act in hurtful ways. But first century culture is a shame-honor culture. Honor in that culture then was your worth in the culture, but that was not a personal sense of self-worth, as we might talk about in our own time. It's a group-oriented dynamic rather than being individualistic. And it is particularly wrapped around the family group and the culture's evaluation of that family group. The head of a family group, or what we could say is the head of the household, is the father. And one of the things that you need to really appreciate whenever you read the New Testament, when you read about fathers, you're reading about the head of the household in terms of Roman order. And the family honor is wrapped up in the father, in his place on this structure, his occupation, which affects his place on that structure, his conduct in the world, does he conduct himself honorably, and his sons. Does he have sons to carry on his good name and to inherit his property, which, as you can imagine, the higher up you go into the hierarchy, the more there is to inherit and the more intense that need for a son becomes, though it's intense all the way through. And so this household then is the place where honor is understood in the culture. It's wrapped up in the father of that household, the head of the household. And when there's an honorable family, then the men in that household can conduct themselves in the world appropriately, whether we're talking about social interactions or business interactions. A dishonorable or a shamed family can't. So this was the primary group in the first century world, and Rome actually adopted this idea of household to talk about the empire itself. They tried to say the empire is just one big household, and Caesar, of course, is the father of that household. In Latin, he was the pater patria, the father of the fatherland. So with this context in mind, you can probably see pretty quickly that women are not going to fare well. In this context, first of all, marriages then were primarily economic arrangements between honorable fathers. And they were arranged in order to produce legitimate heirs, legitimate sons who would carry on the father's honorable name and then inherit whatever the father had to pass on. So our concepts of marriage that revolve around falling in love or finding a soulmate would have been unimaginable, to use that idea, would have been unimaginable to first century people. Marriages were arranged, marriages primarily for economic, and if we're talking about the upper class folks, for political reasons. They were arranged among the upper classes as soon as a daughter was born. Among peasant classes, they were arranged as soon as a daughter had lived into adulthood, meaning that she was able to bear a child. So 12 to 14 years old, somewhere in there. And arranged when a son was able to provide for his family. One of the things this means, by the way, is there was no adolescence in this culture. We sort of invented that time period between childhood and adulthood. First century people wouldn't have known anything about that. One day you're a part of the world of children, and the next day you're a part of the world of adults. In this context then, women existed to produce legitimate heirs, meaning sons, of course, period. Without blood tests or DNA tests, the only way to be sure that a woman's son belonged to her husband and therefore was a legitimate heir was for this woman to have been a virgin when she was married, and for men not to have access to her after she is married. In some provinces in the empire, there were laws on the books about how many times a married woman could be seen in public during a given period of time, for example. And of course, even then, she had to have an escort with her. So all of this means that a woman's sexuality was owned first by her father, who needed to keep her a virgin in order to arrange a marriage for her, and by the way, to be seen as an honorable father. And then her sexuality was owned by her husband. So all of that is the backdrop for reading our stories today about Elizabeth and Mary. So turn with me to Luke chapter 1, and we're going to start in verse 5. First 4 verses, Luke introduces his gospel to a Theophilus, someone for whom he wrote this gospel, although probably not limited. He never in his mind would have been limited to Theophilus, but he wrote to Theophilus and he gives sort of an introduction. And at verse 5, Luke is ready to begin his narrative. Okay, so turn with me there. All right, chapter 1, verse 5. In the days of King Herod of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah who belonged to the priestly order of Abijah. His wife was a descendant of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. Both of them were righteous before God, living blamelessly according to all the commandments and regulations of the Lord. First of all, do you know hyperbole when you hear it? I don't know that any of us have ever known anyone who lived blamelessly according to all the commandments and regulations of the Lord. But hyperbole, exaggerating, it is done to make a point. And that point is, these were really good people. They have good ancestry. They're from honorable families, in other words, and they have conducted themselves in the world wonderfully, righteously, faithfully. Okay, and all of that means that verse 7 for a first century audience would have been a shock. So let's read verse 7. After all that good description of them. Look at verse 7. But. Doesn't that little word sometimes just say a ton? Okay, so they had lived righteously before God according to all the commandments and regulations of the Lord, but they had no children because Elizabeth was barren and both of them were getting on in years. All that information that I just gave you about the first century context should tell you now why Elizabeth's barrenness was such an issue. In this world, because she had not produced a legitimate heir, and by the way, it's always the woman's fault in this world. You notice it doesn't say they were barren. The text says Elizabeth was barren. It's always the woman's fault. So she had not produced a legitimate heir, and that means from the perspective of the first century world, they would have assumed that she or her family, because her barrenness would have brought shame onto her family. So she or her family, but probably her, had done something shameful so that God was punishing them for this. That would have been the perspective of Elizabeth and Zechariah's neighbors. Can you imagine the talk? Can you imagine the things that were said, you know, when Elizabeth and Zechariah were not in the room? Though, you know how that works. You may not be in the room, but you know it's being said, right? And so that's the circumstance that with which we are introduced to this story. What we learn in the rest of the story, rest of Luke 1, is that Zechariah was a village priest, not a high priest. High priest would have been very high up on the hierarchy, but a village priest really is peasant class in terms of naming of class. What it meant to be a village priest was that Zechariah spent most of his time and most of his work in his village, but periodically he would come and serve in the temple. That they would rotate village priests in and out, and periodically he would serve in the temple. What that means for us is that in the order of the day, that Zechariah, though he's not upper class, but he has this significant position among his own class of folks, that he would have been viewed as an honorable man by the people in the community, except that his wife was barren. Think of how even in our time we say such things as he would have been put down by his community. See, that really does reflect this order, okay? And you get lowered. He would have been put down by his community and judged as being shameful. There's something shameful at work here. That would have been the judgment of the community. But here's the thing. Back up in verse 6, Luke tells us very clearly that judgment on Elizabeth and Zechariah was wrong. Remember that. Okay? So in our story, then, the time has come for Zechariah to rotate and work in the temple. And while he is there, he was, verse 9 says, chosen by lot, according to the custom of the priesthood, to enter the sanctuary of the Lord and offer incense. Being chosen by lot indicated, or would have indicated to a first century audience, that God chose him. That's why they did this ritual of choosing by lot. And the understanding was God would have chosen him for this honorable opportunity, okay? Which is another sign for us that the judgment of the people about Zechariah and Elizabeth, for that matter, was wrong. They were not shameful. So while Zechariah is serving in the temple in this way, and we're not going to read this part of the story, but he has an encounter with the angel Gabriel, who tells him that he and Elizabeth will have a son. After all this time, they will have a son, and this son will grow up to become the prophet that we know as John the Baptist. And John the Baptist is the herald of the fulfillment of God's promises. John the Baptist is the one who comes and says, prepare the way of the Lord, which is part of our Advent Gospel reading for today. So he will grow up to be that person. And Zechariah is told in this encounter that he and Elizabeth will have a son. Let's look now at verse 24. Okay? So at the end of verse 23, Zechariah finishes his time of service in the temple and he goes home. And at verse 24, we find out, after those days, his wife Elizabeth conceived. And for 5 months, she remained in seclusion. And she said, this is what the Lord has done for me. When God looked favorably on me and took away the disgrace I have endured among my people. I want you to notice that Elizabeth says the disgrace that she had endured. That's a painful verb right there, isn't it? The disgrace she had endured came from her people and not from God. I hope that she always knew that God had not punished her by making her barren. But what I want us not to miss is that this story shows us clearly that the kind of judging and shaming that human beings often do to one another, which allows us, let's go back to our hierarchy. I keep going back to my little visual tool. That's a part of the comparisons that we do with one another. I'm above you. Or again, think about what we say, they are beneath us. We use that language still, and it reflects this kind of structure. So people had judged Elizabeth and Zechariah, which allowed them to put Elizabeth and Zechariah beneath themselves. But that judgment is shown very clearly in our text to be wrong. It is not the way God deals with us. It is not the way God sees us. And I want to suggest to you that here is a first glimpse of the renewal that God is bringing about in the world by sending us Jesus. Okay, we're going to add some more glimpses. All right, verse 26 then. In the 6th month, and by the way, the 6th month of Elizabeth's pregnancy, which I love, we're counting time in Luke's chapter by Elizabeth's pregnancy, by a woman's pregnancy. I love that. Again, sort of raising the woman's experience up in this telling. Excuse me for that. In the 6th month, the angel Gabriel was sent by God to a town in Galilee called Nazareth, to a virgin engaged to a man whose name was Joseph, of the house of David, and the virgin's name was Mary. And then skip down to verse 34. Let's just pick up a piece of the story there. After Gabriel tells Mary that she will bear a son as well, she says in verse 34, how can this be since I am a virgin? So let's understand Mary's situation now, okay? All that info that I gave you, again, at the beginning of our session today, should clue you in that Mary's virginity at this point in the story is not an indication that she is particularly holy or particularly spiritual. That's how we've sort of treated it in church history, but that's not part of the story when you understand the first century world. What we learn, or what the text tells us when we understand the background of this text, is that Mary's father had arranged her marriage with Joseph's father. And because of that, they are already married. Our text says they were engaged, and that's incorrect. The problem is we don't have an English word for this time period that they're in. This is the in-between. The marriage has been arranged. They are married. What has not happened yet is the wedding. For us, the wedding is the beginning of the marriage. But for first century people, the wedding marked the moment when the woman who was already the wife went home to live with her husband. That's what the wedding in the first century world marked. And what we discover when we understand that background and read this text is that Mary is in this in-between time. Her marriage has already been arranged. She is a married woman. What hasn't happened is she's not yet gone home to live with Joseph. In this time period, then, her virginity is not again a sign of special holiness. It's what should be happening for a woman from an honorable family. Remember, without DNA tests or blood tests, the only way to be sure that a son a woman bears is a legitimate heir is for her to have been a virgin when she goes to live with Joseph, and for no men to have access to her once she is married. So when you understand this dynamic and where Mary is in this story, I hope you can begin to appreciate what it's going to mean for her to say yes to what Gabriel has to say to her. Okay? All right, verse 28. Before we get to Gabriel's full message, let's look at verse 28. Gabriel came to Mary and said, "Greetings, favored one. The Lord is with you." A first century audience jaw just dropped. That God would send an angel to a peasant girl living, by the way, in the outback of nowhere. You know, for us, Nazareth has sort of become the center of the universe because of Jesus. But in the first century Roman world, Nazareth was this tiny little village in the far-flung province of the Roman Empire. I often tell my students, it's the place you go to and you have zero cell phone service. I mean, it's the outback of nowhere. So to start with, Gabriel goes there to a peasant girl who has not yet had the opportunity to do the only thing, according to her culture, that made a woman's life worthwhile. That is, she's not been able to have a son yet. Gabriel comes to this woman, and then his words, "Hail, favored one. The Lord is with you." With this peasant girl in the outback of nowhere. Again, jaw-dropping for a first century audience. You know where Mary fit on this? Like she didn't. Okay? I mean, she has no place in terms of that culture. She is a favored one, and the Lord is with her. Let's look then at Gabriel's message to her, starting with verse 30. "Don't be afraid, Mary, for you found favor with God." Notice he says that twice in case we as readers don't get it. So he says it twice. "You have found favor with God, and now you will conceive in your womb and bear a son, and you will name him Jesus. He will be called great and will be called the Son of the Most High. And the Lord God will give to him the throne of his ancestor David. He will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there will be no end." And Mary said to Gabriel, "How can this be, since I am a virgin?" And the angel said to her, "The Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. And therefore the child to be born will be called holy, and he will be called the Son of God. And now your relative Elizabeth, in her old age, has also conceived a son, and this is the 6th month for her who was said to be barren. For nothing will be impossible with God." So the time has come, and God is preparing to send the long-promised Messiah, who will launch the renewal of all creation into the world. And Mary is the one invited to be a part of what God is doing. But I hope if you can think about first century Israel, if you can imagine Mary in her context. So often, again, we don't allow New Testament folks to be real human beings. So do that with Mary for a moment. And her circumstance and where she is in terms of her marriage being arranged, but not yet living with Joseph, that in-between time. And imagine the consequences. Imagine what will happen to her if she turns up pregnant in this moment. Consequently, I always imagine that there was a long pause between verses 37 and verse 38. The consequences are significant. Denise Levertov has written an incredible poem called The Annunciation, where she captures this moment. Here's a part of that poem. First, I'm going to pick up part of it where she's describing Gabriel, and she says, "Arrived on solemn grandeur of great wings, the angelic ambassador, standing or hovering, whom Mary acknowledges a guest, but we are told of meek obedience. No one mentions courage. The engendering spirit did not enter her without consent. God waited." You know, she's right. In my experience in church, no one mentions courage, but we ought to, because the consequences are enormous. If Levertov is right, then I suspect God waited more than a few minutes before Mary responded in verse 38 with, "Here am I, the servant of the Lord. Let it be with me according to your word." Excuse me again. I want us to look now at verse 39 and have a sense of what happened. Verse 39. "In those days, Mary set out and went with haste to a Judean town in the hill country, where she entered the house of Zechariah and greeted Elizabeth." So this journey that Mary undertook would have been maybe 65 to 80 miles. The problem is we're not real sure of which village Zechariah and Elizabeth would have lived in, but Mary's got to go from Nazareth in Galilee to a village in Judea. So maybe 65 to 80 miles. The text says she went in haste. Rarely in that world did anybody take a journey in haste. You got to remember, there are no buses, there are no trains, there's not even a bicycle. Trips then required effort. Most peasants, by the way, as best we can tell, most peasants in this world never traveled more than 50 miles from their birthplace in their entire lifetime. But our text says that Mary traveled in haste. Notice also what isn't said in the verse. That arrangements were made, that anybody traveled with her, though she was young and pregnant. It is possible that Luke just doesn't tell us those things. But the other possibility is that Luke would have been sort of looking at his first century audience and telling this verse very simply and sort of saying to them, you know what happened next, because they would have. If we're right that this verse, taken at face value, indicates that Mary took off on for them, a long journey in haste by herself, that would have told a first century audience that Mary's pregnancy had created a crisis in her family. And her father had cast her out of the family because she had brought dishonor on him and the other members of the family. So Mary, at this point, does the only thing she knew to do. She fled to Elizabeth, though that meant a journey of 65 to 80 miles, but she's got nowhere else to go. And she only knows that because of Gabriel. I wonder if any of you are familiar with Faith Hill's Christmas song, "A Baby Changes Everything." She doesn't get that song doesn't get all the history exactly right, but it does capture this part of it. Baby does change everything for Mary. Her life had been sort of set forth, and now everything has changed. So how long do you think it would have taken her to walk 65 to 80 miles? She could likely walk farther than we can. First century people walk all the time, and they walk everywhere. And so she could probably do it better than us, but 65 to 80 miles long. And she was young, and she was pregnant. Could she have done it in 3 days? Maybe 4 to 5, however long it took. Go now and stand with her. Once she has finally arrived on Elizabeth's front porch, in that moment when she is about to knock on the door, in that moment before she knows how Elizabeth will respond. And here's something again for you and I to know when we read this, there is a good chance that Mary and Elizabeth had never met one another. Again, this is a world where people don't travel. And so they may have heard of one another in family stories, but they may never have met. It's also possible that at some point Mary's family had made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. And if that happened, they likely did encounter Elizabeth and Zechariah, may have stayed in their home a night or so. And so maybe they met once, but they are not close relatives. You think about the relatives that you may, call if you're in trouble. That's not what we're talking about here. They would not have been close, may not have known each other at all. If they did know each other, it had been brief. So when Mary is standing on that front porch and about to knock on that front door, she couldn't have known how Elizabeth was going to react. And it is possible that Elizabeth's experience with people judging her and shaming her all those years, it's possible that that experience could have hardened her. And again, I'll bet you know people who've done that, whose experiences have embittered them, hardened them. And it was possible that Elizabeth could have been like that, because Mary doesn't know how this is going to play out. But look at verse 41. When Elizabeth heard Mary's greeting, the child leapt in her womb, and Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Spirit and exclaimed with a loud cry, "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb." Not shameful, blessed. Elizabeth welcomes Mary with blessing and with kindness. Elizabeth's response here, again, doing a lot of sort of poetry today, but Elizabeth's response makes me think of Naomi Shahid Nai's poem called Kindness. And again, this is a part of it. And it says this: before you know what kindness really is, you must lose things. You must feel the future dissolve in a moment like salt in a weakened broth. Before you know kindness as the deepest thing inside, you must know sorrow as the other deepest thing. You must wake up with sorrow. You must speak to it till your voice catches the thread of all sorrows and you can see the size of the cloth. And then it is only kindness that makes sense anymore. Elizabeth makes me think of that poem instead of her experience embittering her. It has opened her up. And so we have a story then of Elizabeth responding to the things that she had encountered, and now what Mary is encountering with welcome and with kindness. Can you imagine Can you stand there with Mary and grasp what Elizabeth's kindness would have meant to her and for her in that moment? Can you grasp how renewing it would have been in that moment? In fact, we might even wonder if Mary could have continued with what God was asking her to do without Elizabeth's kindness. Doesn't that make Elizabeth's role in this story particularly significant? It seems to me it does. And so we read these stories, and they are beautiful stories, and they are much loved stories. And I love Mary and Elizabeth, no question of that. But there are also indications of God's renewal breaking out in this story. I already mentioned one. Let me reiterate that and then name some others. A significant aspect of the renewal that God is launching here, and I hope you can begin to see this, is the dismantling of the hierarchical order of Roman rule. This is being undone. It wasn't just Roman rule, by the way. Nearly every other rule in human history has operated this way, but God is telling us not to dismantle that. If this kind of structure is competitive, adversarial, and comparative, and it is, think of how renewing it would be if we let this kind of structure go. As an adult, Jesus will take on this kind of order forcefully. But even now, we can see in our stories today, God's undoing of these kinds of structures begin. Zechariah, who is a village priest, and Elizabeth, who is a barren woman, are key players in what God is initiating. Mary is a peasant girl who has not yet had the opportunity to do the one thing that made a woman's life worthwhile according to that culture. But Mary is a favored one, and the Lord is with her. These three people, and especially these two women, would have been on the very bottom of a hierarchical structure in their day. They would have, and the activities, the barrenness of Elizabeth and then Mary's pregnancy out of turn, so to speak, would have meant also that they were sort of beneath the pyramid, not even on it, because of their shameful activity. And yet God chooses them, operates with and through them in the fulfillment of God's promises to renew all of creation. They are not bottom feeders, so to speak, on this kind of structure. They are beloved children of God, and they are agents of God's renewal. And relatedly, our assumptions about and judgments against our fellow human beings are shown in these stories to be so wrong. Elizabeth and Zechariah weren't barren because of something shameful that one or both of them had done. Mary had not behaved shamefully so as to bring dishonor on her family. That's how people in that culture would have judged them, and they were wrong. God did not judge and shame them at all. People had. And those people were wrong. So think again of how transformed, how renewing it would be for us in our world if we let go of judging and shaming others. If we imagine instead them as they are, not as we assume them to be, and think of the impact on our world if our every encounter with another human being began with, there is a beloved child of God. Not that immigrant, that Muslim, that Democrat or Trump supporter, that liberal or conservative. What if we let go of all of those labels and judgments? And our first thought when we encountered another human being was that beloved child of God. Again, think how transformative, how renewing. A third aspect of God's renewal that we can sense in these stories may be this. While the Christmas stories have a lot of grand things happening, angels are kind of showing up everywhere. We're going to have a star and, honored visitors from the east, people praising God in lots of different circumstances. Consider that the moments that we've examined today, the stories, we've been able to sort of live in and with today, the stories that enable God's renewal to be initiated and to move forward are not really grand kinds of stories. We have a young woman in a tiny village in the outback of nowhere who says yes to God's invitation to be part of something transformative for her world, though it will change her life to say yes to God. There's no music in the background for her. There's no cheering crowds. Instead, she just responds to Gabriel with, "Here am I, the servant of the Lord." Notice the courage in this sort of quiet response of Mary. Here am I, the servant of the Lord. She will participate with God's renewal, though it will be challenging and difficult for her, and it's going to alter her life. Think of the power of courage. And then there's what occurred on Elizabeth's front porch, and then Elizabeth's welcome to Mary. Maybe you have had someone be incredibly kind to you when your world seemed to be coming undone. Think of the impact of that on you. Of all the Christmas gifts that you've been given, or that you might give, or we might give, is anything worth more than kindness in a moment like that? So instead of grand things, which quite honestly, most of us won't have much opportunity, to be part of. It's not the grand things in this story that lead to transformation and renewal. It happens instead with sort of a courageous acceptance of God's call and the kindness that we are willing to share with one another. Think of the renewal that we can bring about among ourselves and our communities and in our world. If we would all do this, think of the renewal that is possible. I'm going to pause here and check. I see there's a question that's come up. Hi, Jack, by the way. So was Mary already pregnant when she went to see Elizabeth? Again, our best guess is she was. That her leaving in haste would have indicated that, or it seems to me that her leaving in haste, taking this difficult journey, indicates that this has created a crisis for her family. And so, though the text does not specify, our best reading of what happened suggests pretty strongly that yes, she would have been pregnant already when she went to see Elizabeth. Okay? And Jack's follow-up is, one of the lessons to be learned from the verse is that barrenness is not shameful and virginity is not necessarily a sign of holiness. And the answer is absolutely, at least in terms of this story. And we have treated those things even in our time because of the way we've read the story in ways that haven't always been particularly helpful, it seems to me. Okay? So as we're drawing to the end of our time today, last week, here's how I'll close. So last week, I chose to close by saying that I hope for Christmas that you get an enlarged and expanded imagination regarding what is possible because God has sent Jesus into the world. I hope you can see in the stories that we've read today some aspects of what God's renewal looks like, that there is a new way of ordering ourselves and our communities, our church communities, our larger communities. There is a new way of relating to one another as beloved children of God, and not judging or shaming one another, but valuing one another the way God does. So I hope that you can imagine that kind of renewal and what is possible when we live those things out in our own time, and what God is showing us is possible. But what I want to add today is I'm going to suggest some gifts that I hope you give this Christmas. First of all, I hope that you will put into practice a saying, at least to yourself, every time you encounter another human being, that is a beloved child of God. That your first response to that person is, that is a beloved child of God. And depending upon who that person is, that may require courage on your part. And the second gift that I hope you will give during this Christmas season, this Advent season, is this. I hope you will share some kindness this Advent season. I hope you will go out this week, next week, maybe all weeks, and be somebody's Elizabeth. Let me take one more question from Frank. Two questions, Frank. First of all, what importance or insight might we find in Mark and John not including this birth story? I'll be honest, Frank, I don't really know how to answer that question. I don't know, they don't tell us why they did, and why questions are really difficult to answer. It's hard to know if that story hadn't become cherished in their own communities, if the way they chose to tell the story didn't require that, and they thought it would more complicate things. It's hard to know why that is. And then your second question, how critical in the big picture was that Mary was a virgin as opposed to not being a virgin. And again, I don't know if I know how to answer that question. If, for example, Mary had already been living with Joseph, does that mean God would not have chosen her? I don't know the answer to that question. Does that suggest something about Jesus himself? If people assumed, because she was living with Joseph, that he was conceived in the normal way, again, I don't know. Those are interesting questions to ponder. And I'm afraid I don't have answers to those kinds of questions. What I think is clear in Luke's telling of the story is he understood that the conception of Jesus was a result of God's work in the world. And I don't know that Mary had to be a virgin for that to be true. But that's the way the story comes out. Okay. And again, I hate to answer. I don't really know, but sometimes you got to be honest, right? Friends, thank you for being with us today. Thank you for joining in on Seminary Sunday morning. May renewal happen for you this week in some way. May your imaginations be enlarged and expanded. And as a result of that, may you come alive, more alive, I should say, in your sharing of the hopes and joys of this Advent season. Blessings on all of you. And I will see you, I hope I'll see you next week. Take good care, and Advent blessings to you all. Thanks. Nathan, again, I'm going to let you turn us off, okay? Thanks.